Welcome back to Tales from the Enchanted Forest podcast, where we delve deep into known and unknown folktales, fairy tales, myths, and legends. We are your hosts, Fox and Sparrow.
Smiley day, everybody. I'm just enjoying the sunshine right now. And it's just like summer vibes are here, and I'm just feeling it, you know?
Not for us. We have snow and sleet scheduled for this week, I guess. And it has also been between very, very humid, where your skin feels like it's sticking to itself, to it's raining so hard that your balcony is shaking. So those are the two extremes in Europe at the moment. Well, at least where I am in Europe at the moment, which is lovely.
Okay, so it's been, not ideal weather. What have you been up to since you can't, live your best summer life yet?
So I feel like the only things I've really been doing are learning another language and working, and it's kind of been a loop. But in my free time, when I am not really a big TV show watcher or a really big movie watcher. Mm-hmm. There are certain shows that I'll watch and certain things I get really into, like some K-dramas or Bridgerton at the moment. But in general, I like to listen to things a lot more, because then I could listen to it and I can do something with my hands. So I am very into graphic audio. So graphic audio is, I guess it's a company, but they do like graphic adaptations of books, and they have a full cast and they have a narrator. So the narrator does all like the different parts that are just like thoughts and stuff or movement, and then the actual characters, like the voice actors, get to speak in the roles. And it's really cool because there's lots of background sounds as well.
It's more like theater of the mind kind of audio, or like a radio play type deal.
Yeah, like a radio drama. That's the closest thing I can think of. Like, because I've listened to some of the BBC radio dramas where they have like a full cast and they do things like Pride and Prejudice or Dracula, and like it's just like people actually, actors or voice actors, but like people actually speaking. But whereas the BBC would never, do a fantasy book or a romantasy book. The graphic audio does a whole bunch of different types. And there's one book in particular, I won't call it out, but I've been really struggling to read this book. I've picked this book up, I've put it down, I've gone through chapter 1, and then I've given up. I've tried listening to the traditional audiobook, I tried reading it physically, I tried reading it online, like on my e-reader. I've tried just...
Is this like a classic book?
No, I can do classics. This is like a modern day book. And
I'm so curious.
well, I don't think you'd have any interest in this book. And to be fair, I'm also losing interest in this series. But it is... Okay, well, I'll just say it. So it's Crescent City. So Crescent City is one of the latest series, I guess, by Sarah J. Maas. And the Court of Thorns and Roses book, I've talked about them on here before. They are very easy to read. They have all the right tropes. They're super easy to follow. Likeable characters. Obviously, if you start thinking too hard about it, like any other YA/adult book, you start to see that there's no real cohesion, or, things don't really make sense. But in general, it's not that type of book, so I don't think too much. As long as I'm reading, I'm not too bothered by things, then it's fine. It's when I start to notice things as I'm reading that I get annoyed, like Iron Flame. There were too many things where as I was reading, I was rolling my eyes. And I mean, the same is true for the later books in these series. But at this point, I've invested so much time. I'm just I want to see what happens to specific characters.
Yeah.
So there are 3 series, basically. There's the Throne of Glass series, there's a Court of Thorns and Roses series, and then there's the Crescent City series. And for some reason, I haven't been able to get into the Crescent City series. And I'm not sure if it's because I've aged out of Sarah J. Maas's books. Because I started reading them when I was in high school. So obviously I read them when I was younger. And so I'm not sure if it's nostalgia that's keeping me kind of into these books.
I hear that.
So, but you don't want to give up on it because you want closure. I want to know, the final things. And she's done this thing where there's some parts that cross over between all 3 books. And she's mentioned that there are connections between all 3 books, all 3 series. I don't know the extent, so please don't tell me any spoilers. But that means that I have to try and read the Thorn of Glass series and the Crescent City series because I want to see, is it like just Easter eggs? Is it like full on, is it full on combining? Like, I don't understand how it would, but I'm just trying to figure that out. So I've tried to read the Crescent City books, and I don't think it's for me. At least I thought it wasn't for me. But recently I've picked up the graphic audio, and the graphic audio I feel is so much more digestible. And it's just so much, it's interesting because I'm not so bogged down by the details, and I don't have to worry too much about, okay, what's happening? Like, who are these people? Who's this person? Where'd they come from? What does this mean? How does that work? I can just listen to it, and it almost feels like I'm watching a show without actually watching anything, which is how I prefer it, because then I can clean, I can go for a walk, I can do a puzzle, I can do other things, basically, while I'm listening, which is how I enjoy listening to things. But, I mean, it's going well. I have picked up another graphic audio one instead. So I'm still making my way slowly through Crescent City. I might do not finish it, but we'll see. But I have picked up Red Rising because that's apparently a really good series, and that's on there, and I'm really enjoying that. So it's just graphic audios, audio dramas. All of it is my vibe at the moment. I did listen to the Pride and Prejudice one as well because that was really good, and that was a BBC one, I think.
When you were talking about like that series and kind of growing out of it, it really reminded me of the Warrior Cat series. Did you ever read these books?
I did not. I've seen them, but I never really read any of those like Anamorphics or Warrior Cat or Magic Treehouse or any of those kind of ones.
Those Warrior books like were one of the reasons I got into reading. I remember just getting really invested. I mean, I'm a huge cat person, and then you call it Warriors. I was like, yes. But like, okay, like each arc of like the series is like 6 books. And I read the first 3 arcs, and that was like such a time investment. And I remember getting halfway through the 4th arc and being like, I really want to know where these characters ends up, because like some characters, like, storylines totally got wrapped up and they left the series, or they died, or whatever, or they were just fine and they were in the background suddenly. But there were some characters who I was still very invested in who had not wrapped up their character arcs yet. And I was like, I just want to see where this goes. And it just wouldn't wrap up, and I just got really tired. And I had bought the next couple books in the series, and I was like, I can't get through it. So they're kind of always on my bookshelf mocking me, even to this day. Like, I read these in middle school, and I still carry around the shame of not getting through the 4th arc. But I just went online now, and I'm so grateful I gave up, because I can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arcs after that, and they're still being made. And it's like, or no, they had 4 more arcs after that, and they're just starting the next one. And it was like, oh my goodness, so much. Anyways, that just triggered like a memory of me just the defeat of not being able to keep up with that series, not recognizing it was just an ongoing series, never going to end. I just thought, oh, it has to be an ending.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some series where I've just been like, you don't need to be this long. There's nothing you have to say that needs to be this long. And that's kind of how I felt about Iron Flame. I was like, this book does not need to be this long. This book is 50% miscommunication and not speaking to each other and just doing stupid things for no reason. But like, I feel like that's what's really frustrating to me, is when like a series no longer feels like it's coherent. It starts to feel like there are different parts that were forced to fit together that don't really fit together, and storylines that have just cropped up that don't really make sense. And so it starts to feel almost disingenuous to the story to continue reading, because it's kind of like, I feel like Cassandra Clare, if that's her name, if I'm remembering right. Yeah. She's one of those ones that I read a whole bunch of the books. There were so many of them, and then they kept going and they kept going and they kept going, and there were spin-offs and there were more books, and I was just kind of over it. Because at a certain point you feel like, is this book adding anything? It's like, the life is too short. I think I read this before, because I used to have a strong policy of, I'm never gonna not finish a book. I'm going to read it to the end. And then I read something where it was like, life is too short to read a book you don't enjoy. And so I found a hack. I'm like, I'll listen to the books I don't enjoy. But I I have gotten really better at do not finishing. So there's been a couple of Greek mythology ones where I've really wanted to get into, like Medusa. And then there was one called Ithaca about Penelope. And I'm sure they were good books. I just could not get into them. And after a certain point, I was like, I'm not enjoying this. This is, I have very limited free time at the moment. And I want to read things I enjoy. So I just did not finish them. So I've just been listening to books and reading physical books because I like to have two books going at the same time. I think they're two different activities. Listening to a book, I feel like, is not the same as reading a book. So I need to do both throughout the day.
Yeah. Sometimes with books or like movies or whatever, if I'm really on the edge and I'm like, this is not, like, this initial beginning's not selling it to me, I will pick a random spot in the middle or near the end and just watch a scene or read read a couple pages from the middle where it should be at its peak and see if it's going to grab me then. Obviously, there's a potential for like major spoilers, but like at that point, if I'm about to give up, it's like, why do I care? I need a reason to hang on. And sometimes that worked for me because then it's almost like I the way I justify it in my head is it's kind of like those moments in a movie where you flash forward to the future moment and then you flash back to where you are. So I just imagine I'm just inserting that flash forward moment to justify if I'm going to keep going or not.
I can't do that. Instead, I just don't finish and I read up what happened online.
I mean, that
I did
also
that with
works
the
too.
Once Upon a Broken Heart books as well. I could not get through the second book. It was borderline cringy at some points, so I just gave up and I looked up what happened and I was like, yeah, that wasn't my vibe. But that's the problem. I keep picking YA books because they're on Book Talk and I keep falling for it every single time I fall for like these Book Talk things. So I've learned my lesson.
Yeah.
I am now picking books that I genuinely want to read. And I've started following different book accounts that aren't very mainstream and honestly that don't promote overconsumption, because I feel like a lot of the Book Talk accounts now, when I look at them, I'm just like, you have so many books that you just keep buying and buying, and so many like of the same book that you keep buying and buying.
Yeah. So speaking of buying a lot of things, transition to what I've been into. So in the past couple months, there's been some good sales on video games, and I've been picking up a bunch. So be prepared to hear about various new games that I'm playing.
Very into that.
I mean, and I feel like this is what this year is just going to be, is me. You're going to hear about all the greatest video game hits of like last year, but I'm only playing them now because I finally got them on sale or whatever. But not in that category. A game I did get on sale, definitely did not come out last year, is this game called The Return of the Obra Dinn. And so this is like a really small indie game that was made a number of years back. It won a bunch of like indie awards. It's like one of those indie darlings.
I love those.
Because of two things. The first thing was it did something really interesting with its visuals. I personally didn't like it, but I was like, I don't know how they animated this or like were able to pull off that visual design. So like kudos to them. It's essentially black and white, but the way like your character moves, like, and the way the colors change and contrast so everything still looks right is interesting. I really can't do it justice on an audio format, but trust me when I say it's unique. But the thing that drew me to the game is it's a mystery game. The Obra Dinn is a ship. It's a sea vessel from like the 1900s, I want to say. And the tale of it is that it set out to sea from England to, I think it was going to India or something, but it got but it disappeared on its way and nobody knew what happened to it. And it's like been like 25 or 50 years later and it just suddenly showed up like just fine. So you take on the natural role of an insurance inspector to go onto the ship and figure out what happened, and if the Crown, because you're representing, I guess, like the Crown Insurance Company, if they should pay out money to people or not. So
if anyone's going to solve a mystery, you can either be a detective or an insurance agent.
Yeah. So the way you do this is you're given a list of all of the names of all 61 passengers that were on the ship. You know their ethnicity and you know what role they had on the ship. And you have a bunch of pictures of people who are on the ship, but you don't know who is who. So you have pictures of just people on the ship, but you don't know which picture is correlated to what person. And then you're also given this pocket watch. So when you come on the ship, you find immediately a dead body, and you use the pocket watch, and it replays the last few things the person heard, and it shows you a still image of what they saw before they died. And when I say still image, it's like the last moment. Like if they got shot, you see the moment they're getting shot, and so you can look around the ship to see what happened. So you can see like a face of who shot it, but maybe you haven't identified the person's name yet. So your goal is to kind of relive these moments as people died and to figure it out. There was a couple of times I identified someone correctly because of their accent. I was like, okay, the person talking to them sounds more Irish than British. And it's really interesting. It really didn't hold your hand. It was really never like, oh, maybe check this out. It was like once they explained the mechanics of the game, you were like, okay, have fun. And there was like no additional help going forward. I just had to like really pay attention to who was talking.
Little twinkling lights that led you towards someone.
Yeah, it was really not handholdy. And then once I had seen all the like the deaths I could, because I would see like I think there was like 23 or 25 of these moments of death that I could view or something, but there was 61 deaths on the ship, and I had to like I would see in the background as someone died that someone else was like going overboard, so their body wouldn't be on the ship, and so I couldn't do that thing, but I could see in the perspective of someone else's death that someone was going overboard. I'm like, okay, well, who are you? You're on the top ship, so you're probably like a seaman, not like a first mate or anything like that. Anyway, so
Aubergine.
Yeah, the Return of the Aubergine. Really clever. Not a long game, it's an indie game, but like it was a really fun trying to like think it through logically of all these things. Anyways, it was really fun. Recommend it. I'm like a baby. Nothing attacks you in this game, but just the general vibes of being on a ship with a bunch of dead bodies, I was pretty freaked out. Even though I kept going online and everyone's reassured me, nothing attacks you. You just view things. It's not scary. I'm like, yeah, but I'm on a ship with a bunch of dead bodies.
You're like, but something could.
So now we've established what we're into this week. Fox, I heard you got a story for us.
Yes. So everyone knows that midsummer, also known as the summer solstice, is coming up. And so in celebration, we have a midsummer-esque story to help you hark in the longest day of the year. It is also the day where the Oak King is slain at the height of his power by the Holly King as he shepherds us towards fall and winter. If you are also surprised it's almost halfway through 2024, then you are right here with us. If you don't get that reference, then I highly recommend checking out our Oak King and Holly King story, which details how the winter and summer solstices are ruled by different kings and what they do to bring in the different seasons. So we are heading back to England, and today we are going to delve into the history of one of Britain's largest prehistoric Neolithic stone circles, called Long Meg and Her Daughters. This site is located near the village of Little Salkeld, and there are 27 upright stones forming a circle, with the largest being Long Meg. So these stones are a lot older than Stonehenge, and unlike Stonehenge, they are free to visit. So if you are in Cumbria, do go give them a look. They are very easy to access, and they are very cool to see. And of course, like most things that people don't understand, there is a folktale associated with the stones, which is tied to witches. And this kind of story was first mentioned by topographer William Camden in the 17th century, where he gave them the names Long Meg and Her Daughters. And then more information was added throughout the years by different historians, including Celia Finesse and William Hutchinson. And of course, the iconic poem by William Wordsworth. However, it wasn't until the 1860s that Mackenzie Walcott added the connection to the wizard Michael Scott, not affiliated to Dunder Mifflin. So this version of the story that we are going to tell today contains all of these different elements and is mainly inspired by the Cumbrian folktales by storyteller Thomas Taffy.
This week, maybe month, has felt super, super long, but the longest day of the year is coming up. So sit back and relax as we recount the tale of the long Meg.
It was before my time, before your time, but it was in somebody's time that a woman named Margaret, who went by Meg, lived in the village of Selkirk. Everyone knew she kept to the old religion and raised her many daughters as part of her coven. Even the village priest knew, but he did not bother the witches as long as they did not practice on the Shabbat. In England, this was not like the Jewish day of rest, which was on Friday, but on Sunday, which was the Lord's Day. Meg respected the villagers and their religion, so it was a very much live and let live kind of situation.
This is probably just me, but I'm kind of in this moment really upset with Hollywood because a couple years ago, there was this movie called Meg, and it was like posters everywhere for it, and it was about a shark. So whenever you talk about Meg, I'm just picturing this giant shark just talking with a bunch of people.
The megalodon.
I'm just like, that's all I'm thinking about is this shark. The situation's not changed. Everyone's chill. It's just a shark for a person.
I have a different connection. Whenever I think of Meg, I think of Meg from Family Guy and how her name is really Megatron. It's just Meg is a nickname for Megatron. I don't know. Meg has many different connotations. Also, how do you get Meg from Margaret? British nicknames are so weird sometimes. So, the witches celebrated on 2 big days, Halloween and the summer solstice. Problems only ever occurred if either of those days landed on a Saturday and the witches did not stop celebrating by midnight. If they did, it would cross over onto the Lord's Day of Rest. One summer, the priest anxiously noted that the summer solstice would be on a Saturday. He took the time to go see Meg on the outskirts of the village and told her to finish up their celebrations by midnight. Now, Meg lived in peace in this village for years, so she was happy to reassure the priest. The only issue was that her daughters were now teenagers, and even witchy teenagers were willful, moody, and prone to doing what they willed. However, Meg promised the priest that she would keep her daughters under control. That night, Meg had her daughters gather as they prepared for the summer solstice. As soon as she told them they had to stop by midnight, her daughters rose in a fury of complaints. They argued bitterly, but did not come to a resolution. Meg only had to hope that they would listen to her. On the evening of the solstice, Meg and her daughters danced around a bonfire in an empty field above the village. They gathered plants, medicinal herbs, and built sunwheels to roll down the hill. As it hit 30 minutes before midnight, Meg paid the musicians and called out for the last dance. Her girls danced, and at the end of the song, they all begrudgingly stopped. However, this is where disaster strikes. Meg and the musicians started heading down the hill. Walking past them, Meg spotted a stranger wearing a long black coat and holding a fiddle in his hands. If the wind had blown his cloak aside, she would have noticed his cloven hooves, but she was too tired and exhilarated from the celebrations to take much note of him. The stranger approached the girls still gathered around the bonfire and asked if they needed a musician to accompany their dance. Defiantly, they handed him a bag of gold and whooped and cheered as they continued dancing wildly. The fiddler played as though the very hounds of hell were at his heels. So, the cloven hooves and the remark about the hounds of hell kind of point that this is the devil. However, in later stories, the fiddler is attributed to being the infamous wizard Michael Scott. Now, Michael Scott was a real person. He was a scholar who traveled around and even worked for the Holy Roman Empire Frederick II as his astrologer and science advisor. He was a polyglot who had an interest in the occult, prophecy, and the future. He even appears after his death in Dante's Divine Comedy in the 8th circle of hell, along with other scholars and false prophets who claim they can see the future. In legends, he is depicted as a wizard, which could largely be because he favored wearing Arabic clothes, so robes, and could write using Hebrew and Arabic, which, people thought was a demonic language they couldn't understand. Later on, it was also written that he had changed the course of the River Tweed and split the Eildon Hills into 3 peaks. But travelers, just remember that the connection to this, air quotes, wizard and Long Meg wasn't made until later in the legend of the stone, so understanding his motivations and actions aren't very clear, such as why would he go after these witches when he was also a wizard, or why he wanted them to be damned.
Okay. The way you described him is very impressive. Like, being a real person now, being connected to this. But like, can you imagine being this guy, but then being like shown your future, like in present day, and being like, when people hear Michael Scott, they will not think of you. They will think of this doofus from a TV show.
Yeah, they'll be like, oh, well, you were quite impressive.
I just feel like it's so unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even know about him until after I saw his connection.
It's like, did the writers know that this is like, this name was being connected there?
I'm sure they must have Googled it before they gave him the name, but because I know a lot of authors will like Google the name of their main character before they decide on the name, just to make sure there aren't any other famous ones or it's not like connected to something. But I don't know. I mean, I don't really see how he could be connected to this wizard unless it's supposed to be like tongue in cheek because this wizard was a polyglot, a well-read scholar.
Yeah.
But of course, he's also misunderstood. So maybe that's the connection, because after he died, people were kind of like, oh, he was a wizard and he was crazy. And they're like, oh, he wrote this book on magic. And it's just Arabic writing.
Because now I'm just thinking of Meg the Shark talking with Michael Scott from Dunder Mifflin. And this is just an amazing story, is all I'm going to say. It's just amazing.
The version in your head is very different from the version that the Cumbrians came up with.
Yeah, I know. I'm just a product of society. And if I'm like this, it's society's fault. They made me that way. Michael Scott.
Either way, despite being Michael Scott from Dunder Mifflin, or Michael Scott the Wizard, or the devil himself, the fiddler played, and as he did, the girls danced and danced as the clock struck midnight. In the church below, the priest stood in horror as the music continued and the bells stopped tolling. He collapsed onto his knees in prayer, but just as he did, a flash of light boomed in the sky, and the dancers were turned to stone. This also included Meg herself, who was just outside the circle, having run back to her daughters. Legends say if you try and count the stones and twice reach the same number, the curse will be lifted and the stones will come to life and in some cases chase you down the hill. Local folklore also recounts how in the 19th century the landowner called Colonel Lacey tried to remove the inconvenience of the stones by ordering his men to blow them up. His workers placed kegs of black powder under each stone, but just as they started lighting their fires, the clear sky suddenly broke out into lightning and thunder. So they stopped, considering that this was, God's will that they shouldn't break these stones. Either way, that is the story of Long Meg and her daughters.
Wow.
And of course, just to clarify, these are Neolithic stones, so they do predate what we know as modern-day Cumbria. So this folktale, of course, is based on people seeing these stones and looking at the almost like Neolithic symbols on them, and trying to put a story together kind of after the fact. It was not made by the Cumbrians. So just to clear it up, because I know when I read this story, I did look into if there was anything anyone could say about like what they were used for. But just like most of the stone circles around England and in other parts of Europe, it just seems like it was part of some kind of ceremony or some kind of burial ritual. This specific one, there's no real reason as to what it is, just that there are about 27 upright stones in a circle, and one of them is outside of the circle, and then there are lots of, I think there's about 69 smaller stones, stones in total, but some of them are just on their sides or on the ground or really small, so just keeping in mind that this is a story that came from seeing something be there and then trying to give it meaning.
I like how just the assumption is that they had enough restraint to be like, okay, 30 minutes beforehand, we're going to tell our musicians to stop and we're going to pack up and go. But like another guy comes by, is like, do you want me to play my fiddle? And they're like, heck yeah, take my money and go. Like, the other musicians were probably there going, what are we, chopped liver? Like, we also still have our instruments.
I'm sure they knew that they had to stop, because I'm sure they were like the village musicians who knew they had to stop right around that time. Otherwise, witches dancing on Lord's Day, that can't be good. I like the idea that Meg and the priest had an understanding where he's like, I'm not going to bother you. Yeah. You do what you want. Turn people to toads. Don't really care. Just, don't do this on a Sunday. And she was very much like, you know what? Fair enough. I'll do everything on I'll do all my witchy stuff, and then pretending like I live in Germany or Austria. I'll just stop on Sunday. Nothing's open.
Yeah, and like even like the way it's said, it doesn't even feel like the priest is like, we will smite you if you do this on Sunday. He's like, just please don't, or you will get, like, it doesn't even feel like a threat. He's just like, please don't.
Yes, well, I mean, in the version that I found, at least in one of them, because a lot of these versions are very, like, minute notes, or they're just, 1-2 lines about the witches were turned to stone because they were dancing on the Lord's Day, and that's kind of it. So the one by Thomas Taffy, of course, he's a storyteller, so he's going to take some liberties to include details, just like we've taken some liberties to include different versions into the one and compile them. But in his version, the priest actually pleads with Meg and says, I'm begging you, don't do this on the Lord's Day. It's too much. Something will happen. But in other versions I found, it doesn't seem like there's any animosity at all between Meg and the villagers. It just seems like they're all living in peace. She's doing her pagan stuff. They're doing their Catholic Christian stuff. No one's really bothering each other. And her daughters are just acting like normal teenage daughters breaking curfew. Except it's very strong consequences this time.
Honestly, this is a pretty good story. I like it.
So don't forget, on the longest day of the night, don't dance too hard, because the next night you'll have the consequences, or the next day you'll have the consequences, is the moral of this story.
All right, duly noted. I will not dance past midnight on the summer solstice.
Only if the next day is a Sunday. If it's any other day,
When
you're
is
fine.
The summer solstice this year?
So it's different times depending on where you live. Obviously, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. And the solstice isn't usually a full day. It's just a moment when the sun is farthest north in our sky, thus marking the longest day of the year. So the solstice will fall on Thursday, June 20th, which is around 3:51 p.m. in North America, and that will be around 10:51 for those p.m. for those of us in Europe. So that will be the moment that the sun is in the northernist spot of the sky, I guess. And obviously different times depending on where you live.
And that is the moment the Oak King perishes.
Yes, that is the moment where the Holly King defeats the Oak King, which is always at the peak of his power. And then from then on, the days start to get shorter and shorter and shorter, until eventually we hit the winter solstice, which is when we have the shortest day of the year. And during that time, the Holly King is defeated by the Oak King.
Pulls out the Uno reverse card.
And then we start the cycle again, and then we go back to the summer solstice next year and the winter solstice next year. And if you are having an existential crisis about how fast time is moving, you are not alone, because it feels like just yesterday we were talking about the winter solstice, and now we're talking about the summer solstice. And then pretty soon we'll be recording our Christmas episode. So time is an illusion, people.
So speaking of time just flying by, this episode has gone by really quick, and sadly we are now at the end. Thank you so much, travelers, for listening and joining us on this tale and adventure.
And with that, dear travelers, we hope you enjoy welcoming the summer solstice with us through this tale. As always, if you want to see the show summary, notes, or updates, check out our website or our social media accounts. We are on every type of social media, from X to Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Bluesky, and Mastodon under our podcast name, or at From Enchanted. If, however, you are old school like Sparrow, you can email us at talesfromenchantedforest@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your questions, comments, and suggestions. So if you have any time on the longest day of the year, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And also, don't forget to rate us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
And remember, there's always a place for you in the Enchanted Forest.